Good morning. Good to see you here today. Glad to see anyone. Honestly, I was at the men's retreat Friday night and came back yesterday afternoon to preach the Saturday night service. But lots of men there, and so I sort of wondered. Well, I wonder if anybody will be at church. But anyway, good to have you here. Hope you had a good week. I had some lake light stuff. I was in Indianapolis and took advantage of being there in Indiana to meet with some of the foundations there, trying to figure out if there's a way to get additional funding for Lake Light and Renew and all of that. I saw some friends. Sherry and I had some quieter evenings, and then there was the retreat. So lots of things going on. I had a good week. I hope you had a good week. And I say that knowing that some of you didn't. I say that knowing that there's always, any given week, I mean, I've been here for 25 years, I've been pastoring close to 40. I know that any given week, people come in who are frustrated or confused or angry or desperate or wondering why God seems aloof, looking for more, trying to figure out why life isn't working. While I was driving, I was making lots of phone calls. I spoke with somebody who was, I spoke with two families who've got a lot of things going, a lot of tension over politics. It's hard to imagine how Thanksgiving is going to work without lots of rules being established before anybody shows up. I spoke with an older couple, and these days that just means our peers. They had adult children who were making some decisions they didn't agree with and trying to figure out, what does it look like? What kind of voice do I still get to have? Spoke with some people who are hurting. Two pastor friends, just very discouraged. Spoke with some people who, there's just the ongoing issues: jobs, marriages, health, money. So just a lot of pain, and a lot of people show up and they're like, so God, why is this so hard? Why doesn't my life work better? Why don't you answer my prayers? Why don't I feel closer to you? So that's a question that has several answers. I mean, it's worth starting by just noting that a lot of things that people are frustrated with today, 6 weeks from now, they're going to say, oh, that was one of the best things that ever happened to me. That was really hard at the time, but I grew through that, and I learned through that, and I'm so much better of a person because I went through that. I'm thankful that God allowed that trial in my life. Not everything that we're thankful for is good. Some of these things we got to call them, they're bad. They're bad. We can learn through them, but some of those things can be hard. Additionally, when we say, why are things going wrong, we have to recognize that some of the reasons things are going wrong is because of sin. So, mine, yours, and theirs. So sin is ultimately self-destructive behavior. If we were all-knowing and we had a good heart and a strong will, we would never sin because it's just stupid. It's like, if you go down this path, it's not going to end well. And so we would not choose to do that. But we often don't see things, or we think we see things differently or better or whatever. And so a lot of times the frustrations in our life result because of sin. Again, mine, yours, or theirs. Genesis 3 announces that sin entered the world through one man and death through sin. And then we have in Romans, Paul makes some points in Romans 7 and Romans 8 that ultimately sort of he doesn't need to make because they're self-evidently true. In Romans 7, Paul has that statement where he says he's complaining about his own brokenness, his own lack of spiritual vitality. And he says, the things I don't want to do, I do. And the things I do want to do, I don't do. Wretched man that I am, right? I am held back by my brokenness. And then in Romans 8, he laments that all of creation groans under the weight of sin. Everything has got just this wet blanket on it because of sin. So some of the reasons that things go wrong are because God is actually growing us in ways that we don't see it just yet, but we will. Some of the reasons things are going wrong and going poorly is because we're just paying the sin tax. We're paying the idiot tax for mistakes that we made or that somebody else made. Today we're talking about a third category of reasons that things go wrong, and that is that we are in a battle. There is a spiritual tussle going on. We wage conflict with spiritual forces of darkness in heavenly places. And so we need to be alert to the spiritual dynamics that are going on around us. Now, let me just note that statement, most of the world, most of history would not be controversial. But today, it can cause some of you to go, really? We're going to talk about evil. We're going to talk about personal evil, like Satan and demons, and like that there are spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realm that we need to be alert to. And we are, because that, I believe, is the truth, and it's what the passage teaches. And it's not just this passage, many others. So I have preached on this passage, Ephesians 6, generally 10 through 20, twice in my life. So 30 years ago, when I was a college pastor, I gave a series on this. And then 20 years ago, when I was here, I did 2 sermons on this. And at the time, we went into the armor of God, which I'm not going to say hardly anything about today, but at the time I went into the armor of God, and I had then our youngest son, Jason. He was 6 at the time, and we got this, the armor of God, right? We got this Roman soldier's uniform, all the gear, and I had him come out and model it. And what I remember is, like, partway through the sermon, I'm like, oh, he's really comfortable up here, and then he starts to ham it up, and it's like, oh, he's way too comfortable up here. And it's like, that's going to be interesting over the next, 30 years to watch him. He likes the roar of the crowd. Like, and the more he did, the more people responded. So I'm not going to go there, but I did read those sermons over this week. And what I was struck by was that back then, I spent more time arguing, trying to persuade people of the reality of evil, of personal evil, not of bad things, but of the fact that there is a spiritual dynamic and that there is evil. So I don't feel like I've got to work quite as hard today to do that. Now, I think I still have to do some argument, because I think some of you are very skeptical of this. But I'll just say that it seems like there has been a transition over time, and that there's been a recognition, and there's been some movement. Initially, there's been this recognition that there can be really smart fools. There can be people who are really bright, high IQ, whatever, ace their SAT scores, Ivy League degrees, whatever you want to say, but they don't know how to live life that works. So what they lack, biblically speaking, book of Proverbs, what they lack is wisdom. They have an IQ, they know information, maybe very technically adept, or very skillful in a particular discipline, but they don't have wisdom. And then it's there's been an additional movement in which it's been recognized that you really can't be educated without having some awareness of the spiritual realm. I remember in college realizing that I was told by somebody, you were growing up at a time, you were in college at a time when people think that you can be fully educated and not know anything about God or spiritual dimension. But they go, that's only true in the West. That's only true in Western Europe and in some of the atheistic countries at the time, and that's only true in America. It's not true in Africa, it's not true in Asia, not true in Latin America, where they would recognize that there are spiritual realities. And if you're going to be an educated person, you have to understand this, because these things are going on, and otherwise you can't fully understand life. So those transitions, and I think in recent years, there's been sort of a bifurcation, and some people are doubling down on the idea that what you see is all you get, but there's a lot more people that are saying, life doesn't make sense unless I factor in there's a spiritual dynamic. The whole modernity, this idea coming out of the Enlightenment, the rationalism, the scientific revolution, all that, this idea that there's only natural causes explaining what's going on. Right? That is sort of modernity sort of grew thin. People said, this doesn't ultimately satisfy who I am. It doesn't make ultimate sense of what's going on. And so we're now in a postmodern era. There's some moderns, there's some postmoderns, there's people that waffle back and forth all over the place all the time. But I think there's been a growing alertness to other things going on. And one of the guys whose books I track, because he has been sort of prescient on these kind of issues over the last 20 years, he writes about something and like 10 years later it comes true, and then he's writing about something and 10 years after that it comes true. And at the time he writes it, you go, I don't know what you're smoking, but none of this makes any sense to me. And then you go back and you go, oh, okay, yeah, you were right, I was wrong. And he's been arguing that we've been living in a disenchanted world, and we're headed into a very enchanted one, where people are going to see all kinds of, not by any means Christian views of things, but there'll be a whole neo-paganism that will break out. Whether that happens or not critical for us at the moment. We are looking at Ephesians chapter 6. So this is the end of our study in Ephesians. Ephesians is a letter written by the Apostle Paul to a number of churches, sort of a circular letter. And the first 3 chapters, it's a little bit more theoretical, and it's very much about God and who God is and the blessings that are ours in the spiritual realm and salvation by grace and the importance of the unity of the church and the need to be filled with the Holy Spirit. And so there's big ideas about who God is and about how things work. And then we have, ostensibly, like a benediction there at the end of chapter 3, where he says, now to him who is able to do exceedingly abundantly, right? And then, blessings in Christ forever and ever, amen. And it sounds like the kind of thing that happens at the end of a service, but he's just pivoting, and then he says, okay, in light of all these truths, therefore, you need to live this way. And there's very specific instructions about how we're to interact with each other and about our speech and about relationships. And he's calling on us to be humble and to be patient with one another and to labor for unity. And so we get some very specific sort of practical applications. Now, there will be something at the end of the section we're going to look at, the sort of the housekeeping things, because when Paul is writing letters, the end of the letters often have, things like, hey, please send so-and-so to come to me before winter and tell him to bring my coat, and tell so-and-so that I greet him. I mean, there's not as much of that in the letter to the Ephesians, because again, it was a circular letter. Not as specific as we get when he writes to Timothy or he writes to Titus or he writes to a specific, just to one church. But we're looking at what's left between those things. And this is the counsel that he gives about spiritual warfare. So I'm reading it now. Finally, be strong in the Lord and in his mighty power. Now, if you've read Paul, you know that Paul often sounds like a football coach, right? Be strong, try harder, get up and do it again, press on, go, go, go. Jesus, when he's speaking to his friends, generally says much kinder things like, don't be afraid, right? It's going to be okay. Paul is like much more grit. Like, do it again faster, we get that from Paul. That's not actually what he's saying here, however. He says, be strong, but then, as opposed to talking about Satan, which is going to be the topic, he says, be strong in the Lord. So it's just worth noting here what he's doing. Like, he's telling us that we are going to be under spiritual attack. Therefore, we need to be closer to God. He's not saying you need to understand your enemy. You need to understand their tactics. You need to understand the battle plans. Here's some case studies. I'm going to tell you what he's like. He doesn't say that. Now, we do get a little bit of information from the Bible about Satan. Not that much, but there's some in Isaiah and some in Ezekiel, and Paul writes a little bit more in 2 Corinthians. And then there's things that we can discern because of the names that are used. So just as the names of God and the titles of God are helpful for us to understand aspects of God, there's a variety of different names that get used to describe Satan. He's the father of lies. He's our adversary. He's the enemy. The name Beelzebub is used, which is literally the translation of that is Lord of the Flies, which is where the Golding novel came from. So there's things we know about him from that. And we can just sort of deduce as we go down the list. We can say, well, we know that Satan was a spiritual being who fell because of pride, and that he took a third of the angels with him. And we know that he is evil. He's not, to be clear, God's opposite. So he is the opposite in terms of God being good and majestic and holy and righteous, and he's evil. But he's not God's equal in terms of power. God is everywhere. God is all-knowing. God is all-powerful. Satan is a very limited being. So there's dualistic religions like Manichaeism and other things that sort of say you got, good angel on one shoulder and a demon on the other, and they're sort of vying it out for you, and they're sort of equal. That's not the suggestion that we get here. But what we are told is that apparently he has more power than we think, and we are prone to underestimate him. So Paul writes and says, finally be strong in the Lord and in his mighty power. By the way, Peter says something basically the same thing. In 1 Peter 5, he says, your enemy is prowling around like a lion looking for somebody to devour. And so it says, consequently, flee. Like, don't stay and do battle, flee. And don't study his motives and his operations, just flee. So what we're getting here, first thing to see is, in order to navigate the challenges we're going to face spiritually, we need to move closer to the Lord. Put on the full armor. By the way, I thought of this when I was driving home yesterday from Grand Geneva. So I was talking with a friend, and he has also was very influenced by John Stott, and John Stott's name came up, and it reminded me 20 years ago. Stott was in the U.S. Stott's a British theologian, big major, Billy Graham's pastor, chaplain to the Queen, 70 books. I mean, just a massive person. And he was in the U.S., and he was traveling around giving some lectures, and there was a few of us that got to travel around with him for a few days. And what became obvious after a couple days is that at the end of these lectures he was giving in various public settings, there would be all these people that would line up behind a microphone to ask questions. And that some of them were there trying to trick him, right? Trying to trip him up. Which I just thought was like, okay, well, this isn't going to end well for you. But Stott, it took me a while to figure this out, but it's that British idea that, British humor is you laugh, 2 days later when you finally get it, and you're like, oh, wait, I think that's what he meant. So this guy is talking with Stott about Satan and spiritual warfare and making a point. I can't remember how exactly he was sort of attacking what John had said, but there was some of that in there. And John said, well, I must confess that I don't know Satan very well. Perhaps you know him much better. And then he went on to make his point, and I thought, oh, that was a dig. But most of us, most of us didn't get it. It was just very subtle. So the goal isn't to know a lot about Satan, but to put on the full armor of God so that we can take our stand against his schemes. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against rulers, authorities, powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. So, two things to note here. One is that the word struggle, the Greek word that's used here, is not the typical word. So there's conflicts that you get into from a distance. This word refers to wrestling on the ground. It is up close and personal. So I have a friend, not that much younger than I am, and he's into one of these martial arts where, every morning you wrestle, and then quickly it gets down on the ground, and you try to choke each other out. So you win if the other person gives up because they're about to pass out. Sounds like a delightful way to start your day, being choked all the time. But that is, he says, that's where fights will go. And information I hope never to need again. But the fights, basically you're down on the ground and it's up close and personal. That's the word that's being used here. It's that kind of struggle. And then the other thing to note is that he says where struggle is against flesh, is not just against flesh and blood, but against rulers, authorities, powers, this dark world, and against spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. He doesn't simply say it's against demons, right? He makes them sound a lot more impressive. Like this list, it rulers, authorities, powers of this dark world, against spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. That sounds like he wants our attention. This is a battle that we do not want to casually enter into. Then he goes on, therefore put on the full armor of God so that when the day of evil comes, you may be able to stand your ground, and after you have done everything, to stand. So having just told us not to underestimate evil, there's a sense in which he says don't overestimate it either. You will stand, right? You will be able to stand your ground. Stand firm then with the belt of truth buckled around your waist, the breastplate of righteousness in place, and with your feet fitted with the gospel, with the readiness that comes from the gospel of peace. In addition to all this, take up the shield of faith with which you can extinguish all the flaming arrows of the evil one, and take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God. So we get both. There's a lot here about the armor of God, starting, I think, as these fights often do, with just the truth, right? We got to deal with reality. Truth is one of the things that clearly has been compromised today. But then you've got defensive weapons like a shield, and you've also got offensive weapons as well. So there's two observations that I want to push here, and honestly, they sort of work against each other. But I think they're two sort of pastoral reflections about this nature of this conflict that we're in. I want to encourage you to approach this from the vantage point of balance and also of zeal. And then I'm going to end in with a little bit more time in prayer. So I got lots of feedback on the sermon from last week, on the post-election sermon. And one of the themes was that many people just appreciated a longer prayer time. And I don't think that is going to be something that happens all the time, but I think today also lends itself to that. So the first thing I want to call you to is to balance. So there's arguably two groups in the room always, some that are making too much of what's going on and some that are making too little. So I hear from some people like, I'm late because Satan blocked all the good parking. You go, okay, I don't think so. Again, Satan is a limited being. I don't think on his to-do list is to frustrate you with bad parking. I just want to say, leave earlier and figure out where you're going to park, right? I mean, but there's some people who see Satan under every problem that they have. And then there's others who never think about the reality of spiritual forces of darkness ever. So I want to say, don't be in either camp, right? I suspect we got a lot more people in this camp, but I talked with somebody after the first service. We got people in this camp. So let me say that I think Lewis gives us a brilliant quote here that sort of summarizes this. C.S. Lewis, in the introduction to his Screwtape Letters, which is this fictional dialogue between a senior demon named Screwtape and his Underwood study named Wormwood, and he's coaching Wormwood on how to tempt people, how to mislead people, how to make people's spiritual lives and lives not work. And at the beginning of the book, at the introduction of the book, Lewis writes, "There are two equal and opposite errors into which our race can fall about the devils. One is to disbelieve in their existence. The other is to believe and to feel an excessive and unhealthy interest in them. They themselves are equally pleased by both errors and hail a materialist," so someone who believes that there's no such thing other than the material world. There's no supernatural world. So they would celebrate a materialist or a magician who thinks that magic is just happening and all kinds of crazy stuff is happening all the time. They would celebrate them with the same delight. I think there's even more wisdom to be gleaned from what Richard Baxter wrote in the 17th century. So Baxter was a Puritan pastor, an author, and he wrote a book on melancholy and depression, and he said, look, and so again, this is 400 years ago, and he said, look, if you are melancholy, if you're depressed, if you're frustrated, if you're feeling beaten down, the first thing that you ought to do is you ought to look at your physical life. Are you eating good food? Are you getting enough rest? Like maybe you're just worn down. The second thing is you ought to look at your psychological or your emotional well-being. Do you have friends? Are you getting affirmation? Are you being cared for emotionally? The third thing that you need to think about is going to take you into the area of moral issues. Perhaps you're feeling depressed because you're feeling guilty because you are guilty and you are violating the law of God, and that is heavy on your heart, and you need to repent and you need to stop doing that. He says, if those things don't change it, then you ought to be alert to the possibility that you are under a spiritual attack, demonic attack. You ought to step back and consider that. So I think this is a very thoughtful and balanced and sophisticated approach. I want to note, I listened to Tim Keller's sermon on spiritual warfare, and I was sort of laughing because Keller passed away a few years ago. Dr. Keller pastored a church in Manhattan, and he was always talking about, all you people who live in Manhattan, you're very sophisticated, and he sort of acknowledges that they think they're sophisticated, and then he would come on and he would say things like, you actually are being very naive, and you're being very simplistic, right? Which you could just imagine is just the last thing that they want to hear. You're being very naive, you're being very simplistic, and you're being very heavy-handed. You're being very culturally insensitive, because most of the world recognizes that there are spiritual forces, but you're closed to any of that. So he sort of went after that, and I think, the opposite is this thoughtful, biblical response to step back and to say, okay, my life isn't working. I ought to do some sort of assessment. If I'm feeling depressed, is it physical? Is it emotional? Is it moral? Is it spiritual? Is there an attack that is being waged against me? So, there are people who find Satan under every rock. I want to say just a little bit more about the people who are, perhaps you, a little standoffish about this still. So I want to underline the thesis here that our struggle is not against flesh and blood. I think a better way to understand this would be to say it's not only against flesh and blood. So Paul would recognize that there are natural problems, that there are natural causes to evil. Paul was, he was speaking out against injustice and racism and poverty, and he's getting beaten up, and he's in prison. There's a lot of evil around Paul. And he would recognize that this evil had a lot of antecedents that were natural things that you could point to. So I don't think it's important that Paul would say, I don't think Paul is trying to say that there are no natural causes of evil. However, what Paul is saying is there are also spiritual forces that can lead to natural evils. There are spiritual forces that can set in place issues of poverty and racism and oppression and anger and all the kinds of chaos that we see in our world. And it's important to recognize that this is what people have been pushing back against for most of the last 50 years. So the idea has been, even if you look at somebody like a Hitler or a Stalin or some other monster, there's this sense that they acted that way because of the things that happened to them. We don't have the language to say there actually are evil people or people embracing evil and doing evil things. So a book came out a number of years ago, written by a professor at Columbia. His name is Andrew Delbanco, and he's a secular guy. So I'm not certain if he's a full-out atheist, but he's a secular guy, secular liberal guy, and he's writing in sociology and economics and other things. And Pulitzer Prize-winning author, thoughtful guy, and he comes out with this book called The Death of Satan, How Americans Have Lost Their Sense of Evil. And what he says is, we now want to explain everything with natural causes, and it leaves us without the ability to say, something darker is at play here. And it's a fascinating book, but one of the best parts about it is he cites this scene in Silence of the Lambs where Officer Starling, so Jodie Foster, meets Hannibal Lecter, the Anthony Hopkins character, for the first time. And Hannibal Lecter is this monster, right? And he's in prison, and Starling is a young FBI agent, and she wants to figure out what's going on. She's trying to solve another crime, and she thinks that maybe by understanding Hopkins, Hannibal Lecter, she can understand this other serial killer. And so she's watching him, and she asks one of the other people there, she goes, what happened to him? How did he become this monster? What are the natural causes that led him to act this way? And the fascinating thing is that Lecter hears the question, and he turns to her. And I can't do Anthony Hopkins. I'm not even going to try. But he responds, "Nothing happened to me, Officer Starling. I happened. You can't reduce me to a set of influences, right? A set of natural causes. You can't reduce me to a set of influences, Officer Starling. You've given up on good and evil for behaviorism. You've got everyone in moral dignity pants. Nothing is ever anybody's fault. Look at me, Officer Starling. Can you stand to say, I'm evil?" And Delbanco says, the West has lost the ability to say, I'm evil, even about a Hitler or a Stalin or a Hannibal Lecter. In contrast to that, the Bible is saying, no, there is evil. There are evil forces. There's personal evil. The Bible describes two kinds of beings that have free will, angels and humans. And with this free will, Satan, an angel, fell to pride and has been corrupted. Evil ultimately never works. Pride ultimately turns us into monsters, and he then has corrupted others. We have moral agency as well. We have free will as well. And in addition to the problems that we have because of the sin in our own heart, our pride, greed, anger, lust, the sin we have in our own heart that gets us in enough trouble, there are forces, beings of evil trying to mislead us. So we cannot be naive to what we're up against. Now, there's more to say in this passage, but once again, I'm out of time. So let me just briefly note, first of all, as a pastor, I want to say that you just want to stay away from everything that is mostly or frequently comic evil. I'm thinking of Ouija boards and tarot cards and the other things. I think a lot of the stuff is just somebody trying to make a buck, and there's not perhaps the evil forces at the level at which they're claiming are behind them. But I would run and get as far away from that stuff as I could, because perhaps there's something there at some times. You want to avoid evil whenever you can. And I also would say there's additional passages. 2 Corinthians 2 talks about the schemes or the methods, the methodology that Satan uses, and notes that there's a lot of deception. He's the father of lies. There's a lot of accusations where he tries to persuade us that we are not loved by God because we're so bad. And a lot of Christians try to hold on, or a lot of people try and say, I'm not that bad. We don't understand that the gospel starts when we say, oh, I'm worse than I thought. It's that God's love is greater than I could imagine. So you've got accusations, and then you've got temptations that come with pride and ego, where we set ourselves up, we think we're better and stronger than we are, and we are an easy prey for spiritual challenges. So there's lots going on there. It's a passage that we ought to be paying attention to. I am going to end this time by asking you to join with me in prayer. Lord God, we pause to acknowledge that we are a bit clueless as to what's going on around us, that we can easily be misled. We can think too highly of ourselves. We can think less about our enemies than we should. We know we think less about your love and grace, your majesty and holiness, your goodness than we should. We want to be steered by you. We want to be drawn to you. We want to heed Paul's advice of being strong in you. We confess that we are frustrated by the fact that our lives don't work, and that often the reason they're not working is because of our own sin, our own blind spots, our own ego, our own pride. We want to say we are also we are discouraged because we are so easily deceived by evil, or we just simply forget about it, and we're not alert to all that is going on in our lives. So, Lord God, we want to be strong in you. I want to pray specifically for those who are here today who are frustrated with the way things are not working in their life, or who have blind spots and sin that they're not recognizing. I want to pray for those who are being misled by evil. I want to pray for those who are asking for more of you and want Spirit of God for you to guide and direct them, but they approach with hearts that are pretty calloused by sin. Father, we are declaring our dependence upon you. We want protection from the evil one. We want protection, Lord Jesus, through you and your blood. We are hiding behind that. We are embracing that, and pray these things in Christ's name. Amen.